2, 1. Good evening, everyone. Welcome. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Nicholle. I work at Tattered Cover Bookstore, and first and foremost, I want to say thank you. Thank you for supporting local independent bookstores. Thank you for being here as a part of our virtual community. I know that everybody is itching to get back in person, but right now we are still virtual, and we're still grateful that you are here with us. Thank you so much. We wouldn't be here the last year over this global crisis that we've had, or the last 50 years without your support. Because that's right, it is Tattered Cover's 50th anniversary this year in 2021, and we owe a large part of that to our community. Before I go any further, I want to let you know that closed captioning is enabled for this video should you want it or need it. And you can do that by getting the black bar at the bottom of the screen with a button labeled CC on it. If you click that button, closed captioning is enabled should you want it or need it. I'm also very excited about this particular event because Tattered Cover is partnering with a local theater organization, Emancipation Theater. Emancipation Theater's vision is to develop a nationwide touring ensemble of artistic abolitionists. And they have a phrase where role play is ritual and stage is our sanctuary. They're a performance art social enterprise dedicated to elevating voices whose stories have been untold. Their name was inspired by a quote from Marcus Garvey: "We are going to emancipate ourselves from mental slavery, for though others may be free of the body, none but ourselves can free the mind." And so we're very excited to be partnering with them on this event. And you can check out more about them at emancipationtheater.com. And you can find out more about Tattered Cover at tatteredcover.com, as well as get all of your bookish needs served there. We have so many events coming up, which is where you can find out all about our events at tatteredcover.com/event. I'm telling you, we have incredible ones coming up. I'm just grabbing my list real quick here so that I can see. We have Nicholle Harris, whose new book, The Other Black Girl, comes out on the 1st of June. And so we have her on Thursday, the 3rd. We have so many other ones coming up, and you can sign up for our email newsletter and follow us on social to find out about all of those. And so now I want to talk about our amazing guests tonight. We are here celebrating the release of Caseen Gaines' new book, Footnotes. And then we have Nicole Harris, who's going to be in conversation with him, who's a part of Emancipation Theater. So a little bit about our guests here. Nicole Harris is currently a graduate student at the Graduate School of Social Work at the University of Denver. She's been involved in theater work for over 20 years and is also an Air Force veteran. She's teaching artist with the Black Actors Guild and Mirror Image Arts, focusing on social emotional learning through theater and improv. Nicole believes in the depth and diversity of the human spirit and the powerful tools that theater can provide. She's excited to be a part of the program at the University of Denver and to learn about the application and impact of these tools within incarcerated populations and systems. She was also the recent director of Tattered Covers and Emancipation Theater's virtual stage reading of A Raisin in the Sun. And then our author of the hour, Caseen Gaines. He's an author, director, educator, and popular culture historian. He's the author of We Don't Need Roads, The Making of Back to the Future trilogy, which led to his television appearances in North America on Entertainment Tonight and Fox Business's Kennedy. His most recent book, which now is not the most recent, but The Dark Crystal, The Ultimate Visual History, was published in 2017 by Insight Editions and received a starred review in Booklist. He holds a master's degree from Rutgers University in American Studies, where he focused on racial representations in popular culture, and in addition to writing, is co-artistic director of a nonprofit theater company where he co-founded in 2005, and a high school English teacher in Jersey, where he's taught for 14 years. And like I said before, the book that we're celebrating tonight is Footnotes, and it is my pleasure and honor to introduce both Caseen and Nicole to you all. And I'm going to turn their cameras on or switch over the camera view here and unmute them. Hello, both of you.
Hello, thank you for having.
Oh, thank you so much for joining us. I'm a huge fan of your book, and as we were saying before we hit record, I know Nicole is too, because we were gushing about it earlier. I cannot wait for this conversation. So I'm going to let Caseen start with a summary of the book, and I'm going to pop out. But just to let everybody know, we are doing a Q&A session later in the event tonight. So if you have any burning questions, please type them in the chat on the screen next to the screen, that you're watching us on right now. And so Caseen, Nicole, take it away.
Sure. Well, thank you so much. And thank you, Tattered Cover, for having. I'm so honored to be here. Love the store. And thank you so much. So yes, my name is Caseen Gaines, and I am the author of Footnotes, the Black artist who rewrote the rules of the Great White Way. Footnotes is the phenomenal story of jazz musicians Noble Sissle and U.B. Blake and comedians Flournoy Miller and Aubrey Lyles, each only a generation removed from slavery, who formed a tenuous alliance that led to the first successful Broadway show with an all-Black cast and creative team. That show was 1921's Shuffle Along. And while you may not have heard of it before, you've likely heard of performers like Josephine Baker, Paul Robeson, and Nat King Cole, who each had this show as one of their earliest credits. Footnotes is largely set among the speakeasies, boarding houses, and emerging Black enclaves in Prohibition-era New York City, and begins with Sissle and Blake and Miller and Lyles begging, borrowing, and finessing their way through vaudeville, with their sights squarely set on Manhattan, a city that was still reeling with the economic effects of a world war and the aftermath of a global pandemic. Shuffle Along opened with its creators $21,000 shy of being flat broke, but by bringing the authentic sounds and dances of Harlem to the Broadway stage, they managed to both attract white audiences in search of something new and Black audiences who wanted to see themselves reflected in something other than minstrel shows. It was revolutionary, playing over 500 performances in Manhattan and touring the United States, including the Jim Crow South, while challenging taboos by daring to show Blacks as more than just caricatures. For the first time, the orchestra section of a Broadway house was integrated, and a revolutionary kind of music, jazz, was heard in legitimate theaters. In fact, one of the songs from the show, I'm Just Wild About Harry, was later used for Harry Truman's successful presidential re-election campaign. The show's unprecedented success forever changed the look and sound of the entertainment industry. So to put it simply, Shuffle Along was Hamilton almost a full century earlier, and many people, including Langston Hughes, credit Sissle, Blake, Miller, and Lyles with single-handedly kickstarting the Harlem Renaissance. Footnotes is a story that highlights the importance of representation and diverse creators living in their authentic truth and sharing the stories they want to tell. But it's also a stark reminder of the delicate dance Black folks have to do to achieve and hold on to success in a country built on our backs, but not built for us to flourish in. A truly American tale of how in 1921, the combined talent and determination of four men resulted in the most unlikely phenomenon of the 20th century, and how, despite their accomplishments, they were pushed to the sidelines, unable to overcome the systemic factors that relegated them to becoming little more than historical footnotes. Footnotes was released last week, almost 100 years to the day that Sissle, Blake, Miller, and Lyles made history with their opening of Shuffle Along in Manhattan. I am so honored to get to share their stories with you. Their stories are the story of America. And that's Footnotes.
Thank you so much for that summary. I'm so honored to be here with you, Caseen, and to be representing Emancipation Theater with Tattered cover. Your book this book is just so incredibly interesting, and I've really enjoyed reading it. One thing that I found interesting was not just the history, so much unknown history for me that's not taught in any kind of standardized way, but also the way that you talk about that delicate dance and the way you narrate that needle of change and how it moves. When did your interest in this history and writing this book begin?
So, and thank you. I really was interested in the story of Sissle, Blake, Miller, and Lyles in 2016 when George C. Wolfe actually staged a version of Shuffle Along on Broadway at the Music Box Theater. So I live in New Jersey. I'm about 12 miles outside of Manhattan, and my vice is going to the theater. Some people like to travel, some people do other things. That's just what I like to do. And I saw this show actually on the second to last performance. And it was striking because while I always have a great time at the theater, there was something that felt very sort of funereal about being at this show at this time, where it was bringing awareness to Shuffle Along 1921, but the show closed prematurely. It had the great misfortune of coming out on Broadway the same year as Hamilton. So the 2016 Shuffle Along was nominated for 10 Tony Awards and lost every single one to Hamilton. And so it felt like justice was sort of being denied yet again in terms of celebrating this amazing moment in our history. And so I went home and started doing a little bit of Googling. And I think the things that really got me interested in telling this story was, number one, learning that Langston Hughes actually chose to go to Columbia University because he wanted to see Shuffle Along. And so that was the thing that brought him to New York. And the other thing was knowing that this was a show that catapulted Josephine Baker, who auditioned for the show when she was 15 years old, was rejected, worked her way into the show at 16, and then ultimately joined the main company at 17. But this was the show that really kickstarted her career. And at the time that she was with Cecil and Blake, she was the highest paid chorus girl in the United States. And so it seemed like, as a Black person who loves theater, for this show to be off my radar, I just felt like it must be off the radar of so many other people. And it was something that I felt a responsibility as a writer to try and uplift these stories if I could.
Oh, that's beautiful. And it's so sad that Shuffle Along was again had this like missed opportunity to be recognized, but also beautiful that you are able to recognize it by writing this book. So what was, because wow, starting in 2016, and I like with all the small little details that you put into this book, what was your research process?
So it's funny because the four people that are at the center of this story were incredible celebrities of the day. And I think that's part of sort of the thesis of the book, is that while they're kind of unknown now, they weren't 100 years ago. And so there were so many newspapers that I had access to. I went to the Schomburg Center at New York Public Library in Harlem and did a lot of research there. I went to Baltimore, that's where UB Blake has his archives. I was able to get someone to help out with research in Atlanta, where there are other archives. And I had an amazing, too much almost, too much to kind of sift through. And what it allowed me to do, I think, was really look at what's the story that I wanted to tell. And it was really a story about representation and racism and the way that sort of intersects with the entertainment industry. And at the time, Broadway, you know, if you were a performer, Broadway was the top. This is pre, certainly movies existed, but this is pre-talking pictures. This is pre-television, certainly. So I really had a lot to work with. And one thing that I really feel like I should mention also is Noble Sissel has a son and a daughter who are still alive. And so I actually spoke with Noble Sissel Jr. quite a bit for the book as well. And that was just amazing to have living history contribute to this book as well. So that was a part of my research process.
That's just incredible. When you looked into these archives, was it like interviews that you found? What kind of, was there media? Was there any kind of like memoirs or anything that was written by any of the people you wrote about?
There was a little bit of everything, actually. And, you know, I've only told like 2 people this, period. But I'm going to tell you, I actually found not only, there were some unpublished memoirs that had never been seen, certainly photographs, some audio interviews, video clips, but one of the things that I also found were some personal correspondence. And in fact, so when you go to these archives, everything is very well documented and there's a good index of what's in there. But I found a bunch of adulterous love letters
Wow.
to UB Blake that were not even in the index. They were just sort of like lost in one of the folders. And so, I mean, you know, you have to go and sift through all the paperwork. You never know what you'll find in these archives sometimes.
That's scandalous.
It was very controversial, and I was there, and I was like, "Oh, should I tell them? I don't know what I should do with these love letters." But yeah, and they were very thirsty. They were very thirsty love letters. So they were interesting.
Oh, that's yeah, I would be interested in reading them myself. Uh, so were there any so given that you had so much and you really had to focus, were there any really interesting things that you wish could have made it into the book that just didn't quite fit?
Yes. Yeah. Wow. So I think so. One of the things that made it into the book in part was a section where we actually go to France. So while the book is really, it's about Shuffle Along, quote unquote, but it's really kind of a group biography of the four artists who created Shuffle Along. And one of them, Noble Sissel, went to France. He was a part of the war effort in World War I, the 369th Infantry, the famous Harlem Hellfighters. And that chapter was probably twice as long as it is in the book. And my amazing editor said, I'm glad that I read it. It's beautifully written, but we have to get to New York quicker. So we have to kind of pare that back a little bit. So that we lost some of. And then there was kind of really interesting stuff that that the main characters did later in their career, but it seemed like the story of Shuffle Along made a good kind of through line. So the book kind of stops at 1952, and then it jumps ahead to 1970, I think, 4. So that period that's lost in the book, there's some interesting material there too, but it was just a little bit too much. There was going to be a Shuffle Along Vegas show, and at some point, I mean, there were just all of these other things, but
I wish there'd be a Shuffle Along Vegas show now.
Let's do it. Dreamcast.
Yeah. So I also find it interesting that there's all this war history that's untold, and I feel like that could be a book in and of itself when we start to think of how performers had this interesting dynamic with our war history, because Josephine Baker has war history as well with our country.
Yeah, and I think that was part of what was really important to me, because certainly we know Black people are not a monolith. Black performers were not a monolith either. And certainly at that time, Shuffle Along was just a couple of years after the end of World War I. And it felt like you couldn't tell the story of this show without putting it in the context of where these men had been. So the war effort was a really important story, particularly because you had people like W.E.B. Du Bois arguing that Black men should go and fight overseas because when they come back, certainly America will recognize their full humanity as Americans. And that wasn't what happened. It isn't what happened at all. And in fact, we had the greatest period of racialized violence in this country in the summer of 1919, when all of these men returned back. And so lynchings were regularly written about in newsprint. And, in fact, just for context here, the Tulsa Massacre was just 1 week after Shuffle Along's opening on Broadway. So when you think about what's going on in the country at this time, it's amazing that this all Black show with an all Black creative team, all Black orchestra, that it was able to succeed and really become a sensation in 1921, when there were all of these systemic factors playing out around, outside of the theater walls.
Well, it's so interesting how progress in culture still always coincides with this existing oppression, and still does today. It's just such a juxtaposition, I guess.
Yeah, and I think that, we've talked a couple times about this delicate dance, but I think you really, it was important to sort of express that, because I would feel like I was doing a disservice, frankly, to those artists if I just said this show came out of nowhere. It was an amazing hit. Black people loved it. White people loved it. It started the Harlem Renaissance. Ta-da! You know, like it. The amazing thing about the show is the oppression that they had to work through in order to make it. And in fact, even once they had made it, they continued to face oppression to the point where they had staged a couple of revivals of this show, and neither one really was successful. Particularly the last attempt, which was in 1952, and what, without spoiling too much here of the book, really one of the things that happened with that last attempt was, you know, kind of the white establishment of Broadway really took over this thing that originated with these Black artists and imposed a white director, white producers. They completely rewrote the book, completely rewrote the score, and it was still called Shuffle Along, but it was this shell of the show that existed in 1921. And if you just use that as a case study and say it wasn't just Shuffle Along this happened to, but for the last century and certainly before that, you see this sort of co-opting of Black culture for the profitability of, you know, better established white people, and this is one of the cases of it.
The version of Shuffle Along that you got to see in New York, was that version the version that had been kind of revised, or was it the original version?
Yeah, so it's interesting. That version in 2016 was it was actually called, this is the full title, it was Shuffle Along, or The Making of the Musical Sensation of 1921 and All That Followed. And so it sort of purported to tell the story of the making of the show, but it was really focused very specifically on the making of the show in terms of, I think it begins like in rehearsals. It pretty much ends as the show is sort of wrapping up. So it's really kind of focused in the book, really, in what is maybe a two or three chapter span. And one of the things that I was really able to do with the book was flesh out who these artists were as people and where they had come from, and a little bit about their lineage. You know, most of them had parents that were slaves. 3/4 of them were college educated. I mean, it's just sort of an interesting dynamic to think about. And that was something that I was really able to flesh out, even, you know, talking about the war history and things like that, and a bunch of other fun sprinkling of things that that people will see. But it's really, yeah, a lot.
Well, because I think one of the things that I just found so interesting about the book was like these barriers that were faced. For example, like the barrier in education, whereas Florney Miller was college educated, but UB Blake dropped out. I'm like forgetting when. Yeah. And how that is still, I think academia is still a gatekeeping barrier in society today. And so all of these different barriers, it's interesting to look at them and put them into the context of present day and see how they have changed, how progress has moved, and then also how it hasn't.
Yeah, you know, I think that's actually, it's a really good point, Nicole, because I think one of the things that hopefully comes across in the book is this show succeeded in large part because these artists were incredibly exceptional. And so the opportunities that they were sort of able to create for themselves were not necessarily afforded to all Black performers. And even though they were so incredibly talented, they were hardly afforded to them after Shuffle Along. You know, UB Blake, who dropped out of school, I mean, he was, it's fair to say, a musical prodigy. I mean, he's someone who could play the piano with fluency when he was like 4 years old. I mean, so when you think about that talent, he was very lucky to be mixed up with, you know, the rest of his brigade had all gone to college. And I wonder sometimes, actually, even with all of his talent, if he hadn't been a part of that quartet, would he have been able to make it as well? It's we've all had that experience, right? Where like you see, whether it's a community theater performer or like someone at like right before the pandemic, I was in New Orleans and there I was at like a karaoke bar and there was someone singing there was someone singing and I was blown away by this, and I was like, why aren't you on the radio? Like, and I just wonder like what are the factors that prevents that person from being on the radio? Because they have the talent, they just don't have the access.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And access is such an incredibly important point when you consider like how this even, well, as you were saying, like how this even was able to come to life, like how Shuffle Along even happened. So what are your thoughts on how I think history is looked back on? Like you speak of this delicate dance and the discrimination that was endured, and also like the shadow of slavery that was just almost, I felt like it was almost like palpable in your book. You also speak of like the minstrel shows, and even a lot of these people had to endure they had to do blackface and be involved in minstrel shows. Do you think that some things have to be endured to create change?
Yeah, that's the big question, right? I mean, I think that's sort of the question that I hope readers ponder, because there are things about Shuffle Along that are so incredibly revolutionary, and yet, as you said, there were stereotypical elements. There were Black actors in blackface. There were only a few. Most of the actors were not, but there still were some. And they were the stars of the show. They were the blackface comedians, Miller and Lyles. By contrast, you had Sissel and Blake that performed in tuxedos and never wore blackface. And when they were done playing Shuffle Along, they would go play for the Wanamakers and they would go play for the Schuberts and play these upscale parties. And so you sort of had that mix of, the new Negro, as it was referred to at the time, and sort of this comforting antebellum, really stereotypical, darky humor and Southern humor. And so this is the question, right? And I think one of the things that you see over the course of history with Shuffle Along is, in part, it's forgotten because so many of the elements end up being sort of pillaged by white producers and other shows that have more resources. But in part, also, there is a real concerted effort by the Black community to say, we don't want to remember a show like Shuffle Along. Like, yeah, we know that performers had to do that back in 1921, but we don't want to look back at that. We've moved on from that. And whether it's Step and Fetch It, whether it's Hattie McDaniel, who was the first Black woman to win an Academy Award, whether it is Buckwheat on the Little Rascals or things like that. I mean, there are these moments in our history where we sort of turn our back and say, okay, we recognize that it happened, but we're going to bury that for the sake of progress. But sometimes when you do that, there's value in remembering that that's what Black folks had to do. And it makes you appreciate.
We went through.
Yeah. And I think it, in a way, it almost gives people a pass to say like, oh, things aren't that bad. It wasn't that bad. Like not remembering those things actually can have the opposite consequence than what people are intending when they kind of put them in the vault.
Well, and do you think you could have one without the other when you look at how progress occurred?
Yeah, I don't think so. I think it's always, I don't know if I want to say it's one step forward, two steps back, or the opposite, but it's always push and pull, right? We have Obama, we have Trump, like it seems like that's the way it always kind of works. And hopefully, if we're doing this thing right, you're taking more steps forward than you are backwards. And I think that we've done that. I think that Shuffle Along, even despite the elements that might make some people cringe today, you can't deny that it created jobs for Black performers. It put Black people on Broadway at the time. And I love this actually. We talk in the 2016, like I'm there, like I'm some Broadway producer. Like, but you know, the 2016 Broadway season was revered as the most diverse season on Broadway because we had Hamilton, we had Shuffle Along, we had the Color Purple revival, we had On Your Feet, we had Eclipse, we had just a bunch of things at that time. But there were more Black people on Broadway in 1924 than there were in 2016.
Wow.
And that's just an amazing thing to think about. But if you don't remember that, if you delete all of those shows, you know, there's value in remembering that. And I kept thinking when I was writing this, you know, I know that, you know, you work with artists all the time. And I kept thinking about all of these artists that don't know that a show like Shuffle Along existed. And when you think about the Great American Songbook, and when you think about famous playwrights and things like that, you know, you come up with your George and Ira Gershwin, your Sondheim, your Rodgers and Hammerstein. You know, why aren't we thinking about songs like I'm Just Wild About Harry as a part of our musical theater history? They were there, and they were kind of there first in a lot of regards in terms of what we think of as being the canon.
I didn't know before your book, I didn't really know much about Shuffle Along either, which is just so, and I didn't know that Broadway used to be called the Great White Way.
Yeah.
There's so much that I didn't know about that history that it almost felt like I was almost kind of upset to be like, well, not that like Hamilton and like more recent shows and like works haven't made progress, but to not know the older history, you know.
Can I ask you, like, how do you, as an artist, like if you knew Shuffle Along, like you knew West Side Story, like you knew The Wiz, like you knew, like if you knew that this show had existed in the 1920s, like do you think that it would have changed the way that you looked at theater or your work?
I mean, I think it would have to an extent. I mean, I did learn a lot about the Harlem Renaissance in high school, but to have known that this show was a part of that would have given a different representation than I had an awareness for, and it might have changed even just my confidence in the way that I showed up on stage. I think, yeah.
Yeah, and I think that is important, you know, just to be able to see yourself and know that, not just see yourself, but to know that you've been there, you know, to know that it's not, you know, Broadway, especially Broadway, is something that feels so exclusive, doesn't it? You know, it feels like the ticket pricing is exclusive, you know, and it doesn't matter what show you go see. You can go see The Color Purple, you're going to see more white people than Black people at every Broadway show. And it feels like in theater programs throughout the United States, like it's not uncommon to be the one Black kid. And oftentimes, you know, what you're putting in your book to go on auditions is, you know, Dream a Little Dream or something from Secret Garden or something like, you know what I mean? And so there are things that we consider legitimate theater and things that we consider to kind of be other, you know, or theater with an asterisk. And I wish more people knew about this. And I'm glad, I'm so happy to be able to do my part to help reintroduce this to more people so that they know that we were there as well.
I think that's why I just like read this book so quickly, is that it just felt like I just cherished like knowing these facts that I didn't know about our history, especially within an art that I love so much. And so I'm incredibly grateful that this book exists now. I have one more question for you. And it might be kind of a complex question, but I wondered, as you were talking about telling the stories of these complexities of what had to be endured, and the importance of knowing that, did you struggle with trying to strike that balance between like telling the story of what was endured as well as telling this like the stories of like those two worlds that you spoke of?
Yeah, I don't know if I'd say that I struggled with it, but it was important to do it. It was definitely a priority for me. And I think even in looking at the characters, the men who really existed, um, one of the things that, in theater, you always tell actors that you can't judge the characters that you're playing. People might do things that are things that you would never do. But if you're playing that character, everyone at all times does things that make sense to them, for them in that moment. If you're running late and you're on the highway and you're going 90 miles an hour because you can, like, it's wrong to do, it's dangerous, but you're running late and that's what you have to do at that moment. And there's no judgment, there's no self-judgment in that. So I really had to, it was important for me to always remind myself that this is 100 years ago. Even something like blackface and black actors in blackface, you can look at that and you can say, well, why would black actors do that? But to be honest with you, the reason why is it was a way for them to gain representation in what was previously all white spaces. If there were white actors that were putting burnt cork on their faces and imitating black people, making a buck at the expense of black people, why couldn't black actors do it? And you know what? A black actor, 9 times out of 10, could do a much better tap dance than the white actor imitating them. And so they could actually get the gig. And so, yeah, is it a nice part of our history? No, but was it one of those complicated things that, black performers had to do? Absolutely. And I think telling that without judgment, just telling it the way that it was, it's, for me, this book is really kind of a product of the quarantine, I guess I'll say, in a way, because so much of the writing really was informed by what was going on this day last year, frankly, where there were opportunities to find joy if you were fortunate enough to be able to, and we were just being slammed with the economy, the pandemic, racial strife, Broadway being dark even, and literally so many of those things were things that I was writing about even. The Spanish flu was in the period of time that this play came out of. And so it was easy to be reminded that history repeats itself. And it was complex then like it's complex now.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much.
Thank you.
I could listen to the pair of you talk for another hour. I think this book, truly, this book has generated such wonderful discussion and thought, as you were saying, about history and the present. And for both of you as artists, and as a theater nerd myself, this was just wonderful. And I know that other readers are anxious to get their questions in. So I want to encourage everyone as they're watching now to submit some of their questions. And I think this one actually flows really nicely into what you two were previously talking about. I was just listening. But how did the pandemic affect your writing? And that said, how did Broadway and theaters in general being dark affect your writing? So you mentioned a bit of it, but I wonder if maybe it affected your writing process in any way, or if you want to elaborate.
Yeah, it gave me, I'm a horrible multitasker, but I'm really good at compartmentalizing. They're different things. And so this really gave me the ability to have a beautiful silence, you know, and I could really just go in and write and finish this book. And really, to be honest with you, the majority of the book was written while we were quarantined. So that was great. And luckily, thank God, I had all of my research and I'd gone to the libraries and I'd done all of that, because if I hadn't, you know, I don't know what I would have done. It wouldn't exist right now, the book. But the other part was, there was just such a heaviness to the world. I mean, like, I was thankful to have the time to write, but you know, it was, you're writing about a show and it's, you know, it's glitz and glamour and the curtain and the, you know, it's New York and lights and but then also in a way, I mean, I don't know if I've ever really articulated it in this way, but in a way I was almost thankful in a strange way that there were moments in the book where there were dark times, because I don't know if I would have been able actually to write a purely happy story about a great Broadway show in this climate. There was almost something kind of therapeutic about writing about some of the heavier things that are covered in the book, while there was so much heaviness going on in the world. But to the question about Broadway being dark, that was probably the hardest part for me, because I live close enough to Manhattan where I could go in, you know, I could get off this right now and be in Manhattan in a half hour. And to not be able to see a show and hear an audience and see the lights and see the marquees and just walk around. I mean, I couldn't even walk around New York at the time. I mean, that probably hurt more than anything else, to be honest with you.
Completely understandable. It's still heavy, and the fact that we're still trying to come out of that heaviness and into probably more heaviness in a different way. You know, it's not, we think it's like COVID's over and stuff, but it's not the end of it, for sure. This is a really great one question as well. Do you think that Shuffle Along has aged well?
You know, I'm going to ask Nicole, actually, having read about it, do you, even knowing, you know, everything that's kind of in the show, would you be interested in seeing Shuffle Along restage in its original iteration, or do you think that Shuffle Along is something that's best left in the past?
I would absolutely be interested in seeing a restaging of Shuffle Along, but I'm also like, I would also like to see it with like a follow-up, maybe like, I would love to see the kind of conversation that comes from it, you know, and just even with looking back, sometimes I feel like looking back and seeing where we've been can continue to help create and push forward more progress. So I feel like it would be really, like, for me, just from reading this book, I really want to see it. But also I feel like it would be, it's like it's kind of like that, what you were talking about, like that need to remember the harder things that we've been through, but also I would wonder like what kinds of things would be celebrated about it too.
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely. This is also a question for both of you. What was your most formative theater experience? I think as artists in your own way, that would be a very interesting one. Caseen, do you want to take that first?
Oh, no, don't pick me first. That's hard. You know what? I have an answer that's in my head. I don't know if it is. You know what? Here, I do. I have two answers. I'm going to give them quick. The first is probably the, I can't remember if this was the first Broadway show I saw or if it was the second. It was one of the two, but I saw Bernadette Peters in Gypsy. And it was just,
I'm sorry. We're just gonna end this call right now. We're just gonna talk about it. Relive that for us.
it was amazing. And here's the thing. I went into it cold. Like, I didn't know the story of Gypsy. I didn't know that I knew the songs from Gypsy. So I knew this in like, so when everything's coming up, Roses is coming in, yeah, I'm like, oh, I know that one. But what to me was, if you know the show, the end of it has such a great build to the end of Act One, and then when we went to intermission, I was like, but what happens next? What happens? The show is kind of, it's almost like Into the Woods. It's like, but the show's over at the end of the act. But then there was a second act, and the second act is great too. So that was like really great for me. But then I think the moment that boy was the most powerful for me was I have been blessed and fortunate enough to have seen Hamilton on Broadway. And one of the times that I went, there was an understudy in, and I was like, oh, it's an understudy. I mean, I hate to be that way, but I was like, it's an understudy. You know, look, if you're going to Hamilton, you're allowed to have that reaction when you have an understudy. And it was an actor by the name of Michael Luello, I believe is how you pronounce his last name. And he is a brown-skinned black man who they do, everyone's heard the opening number to Hamilton. They do the whole thing, and a hurricane came, and they do the whole thing, and then he comes out for Alexander Hamilton, and I swear, tears came out of my eye. I could not. I was like, oh, this is who's playing Hamilton for the next 2.5 hours? Like, let's go. Like, I could not believe what was about to happen. And I looked around to be like, is everyone seeing this? Like, I could not believe it. And representation matters. It's almost like a cliche at this point to say it, but I can't tell you, when I saw this, as a grown adult, I felt like my life was changed, and it was like 2 years ago. You know what I mean? Like, it was just that impactful for me instantaneously. So that's probably the moment.
Cliches are based in truth, so it's still true to this day. And Nicole, what is your most formative theater experience? If you can pick this one.
I thought I had my two, but then when Caseen started talking about Hamilton, I also thought about when I saw Hamilton. I had such an emotional reaction from like just even the moment that that it started. Like, it starts with one black man on the stage standing in his strength singing, and I had such emotion because I'd seen so many shows on Broadway and had never seen this kind of strength and representation, and it just really touched something in me to my core. And then like all of the references in it, like the Schuyler sisters using harmonies that were inspired by Destiny's Child, and different rap verses that I recognized from, I'm blanking right now, but just there were things that I recognized, and so like to have Black culture celebrated in this way, that was also like recognizing like the foundation of our country, even though they weren't stories of Black people. It was something about that was very beautiful. I think the other experience that I was going to talk about was seeing Rastus and Hattie, but also being in a show in high school that I wrote with other playwrights. Like, I went to the Cleveland School of the Arts, and my cohort, we were predominantly Black, and we wrote a play about living in the projects. And it meant something to me to learn that like we could communicate with an audience in that way, and like tell a story and an experience and a shared experience in that way. So
I love the varies of that, and the fact that you mentioned it at different points in your life. And Caseen, you did the same thing about I love that, one, you didn't just pick one experience, but I love two, that you picked different experiences at different points in your life that obviously have shaped you into the artists that you are today. The last question that we like to ask here at Tattered Cover is for both of you again. For you, Nicole is the reader, and for you, Caseen is the writer of this book. And it's, what did Footnotes teach you And you can interpret that however you like. We've had a long conversation about learning and growth. But Nicole, I'd love to start with you, and then we'll end with our author of the hour, Caseen Gaines here.
Well, I could focus on like some of the facts that just really struck me throughout the book, but I don't want to give away any of the book. And so I feel like I think one thing that's sticking with me right now is just representation, like the fact that I didn't know so many of these things. And when I look at who is writing and creating curriculum and education in our country, like the importance of having other experiences, of having Black people write education and write our stories, and what that might look like. And it also just inspired me myself to continue to seek out this kind of work, because I was just, yeah, I am like, I'm stuttering, but like, I'm so honored to meet you, Caseen, because I just really got a lot out of reading this book.
Oh my God, Nicole, thank you so much. And boy, you know, I think, I don't know, the questions kind of make me emotional a little bit, to be honest with you. It actually is.
Just take it as you will, you know, it's okay.
You know, I think it's, I think what Footnotes taught me is that we tend to think that even though we know better, but I think we tend to think sometimes that like we're the first people to do X, Y, and Z. That like, you know, the things that are important right now will always be important. People will remember them centuries from now. And, you know, you can look at someone like Oprah, you can look at someone like Beyonce, and you can say like, these are, you know, Bill Gates, even if you want to go in that direction. You say history, you know, 100 years from now, certainly everyone will remember who Oprah Winfrey was. And the reality is probably not, because 100 years ago, there were Oprahs, you know, 200 years ago, there were Oprahs. And, you know, how much do we remember them? And if you are lucky, what you do lasts, even if your name fades away. You know, if you are lucky, you move the needle of history forward and kind of press your hands into the wet cement of time. And you know, the book is really called Footnotes because footnotes are kind of pejorative. You know, they're kind of these ancillary parts of the book. You can skip them if you want, but boy, if you are lucky, we all get to become footnotes in someone's story. And even just to be a footnote in someone's story means that you've made it. And so that's really what this taught me, is just to do whatever I can to make my mark, and hope that happens.
This book is a great way to start, because you've already, in the last week or so, and many people who've read it before that and edited it, and where you've helped educate them and change them in multiple ways. And I know that Nicole and I are among that group, and we thank you. And I know that our viewers feel very similarly. And for those of you who have not yet read it, but you should, get your copy of Footnotes at tatteredcover.com or at any one of our locations. We've been honored tonight with Nicholle Harris from Emancipation Theater and Caseen Gaines, author of Footnotes. I want to give each of you a chance to remind people who you are, where they can find you online, and anything else that you want to say before we close out this evening. And Nicole, once again, I'm going to have you begin and end with Caseen.
All right, thank you very much. Again, I'm Nicholle Harris with Emancipation Theater Company. You can check out our work at emancipationtheater.com, and you can also check out some of the work that we've been doing with Allies to Abolitionists group on Facebook.
And I'm Caseen Gaines. I'm the author of Footnotes, the Black artist who rewrote the rules of the Great White Way. I'm available at CaseenGaines.com, CaseenGaines.com, and I'm on social media, Twitter, Instagram, Facebook at Caseen Gaines. And I just wanted to say thank you to Tattered Cover yet again. I really love your store. Thank you so, so much. And I appreciate you. Please buy the book there. Go get it at Tattered Cover, please.
Well, we have copies, and we're so excited for this book. I've already written my shelf talker, and I need to add other ones for our other locations. So I want to say thank you both for your time this evening. I'm Nicholle with Tattered Cover Bookstore. If you'll just stick around while I close out here. For some of you out there, it's dinner time. Maybe think about ordering from a local mom and pop shop. Shopping in your community and supporting local businesses helps us more than you know, especially while we're still trying to climb our way out of this global crisis that we're all in together. As a human society. So thank you so much for that support. Check us out at tatteredcover.com. This has been Footnotes with Caseen Gaines, and Nicole Harris. Stay safe, everybody, and happy reading. Good night, all.
Good night.
Night.
And we're out.
Thanks, Nicholle.